welcome to AUDCIS, Auditing in a CIS Environment. So today we'll be proceeding with Module 3, which is IT Governance and Strategy. We have the following objectives for this module. Describe IT governance and explain the significance of aligning IT with business objectives. Describe relevant IT governance frameworks. Explain the importance of implementing IT performance metrics within the organizations or within the organization, particularly the IT balance scorecard. Describe the steps in building an IT balance scorecard and illustrate supporting example. Discuss the importance of regulatory compliance and internal controls in organization. Define IT strategy and discuss the IT strategic plan and its significance in aligning business objectives with IT. Explain what an IT steering committee is and describe its tasks in an organization. Discuss the importance of effective communication of the IT strategy to members of the organization. And lastly, describe the operational governance processes and how they control delivery of IT projects while aligning with business objectives. So IT governance is the alignment of IT with business objectives. It includes the following. So adequate implementation of internal controls, provision of the structure to achieve alignment of the IT activities and processes with the business objective, incorporate IT into the enterprise risk management program, manage the performance of IT, ensure the delivery of IT value, and meet certain of regulatory compliance. So these things make up the IT governance. But basically, IT governance just means that the business strategy is aligned with the IT objectives. So basically, how the IT objective goes or its projects, its plans is closely related to the overall strategy or the business strategy of the organization. So in the provision of IT governance, we follow certain frameworks. So there are three best practice IT governance frameworks that is used by different organizations. So we have the IT Infrastructure Library, now called just ATIL or ITIL. Next, we have Control Objectives for Information and Related Technologies, that's OBIT, and the British Standard International Organization for Standardization, ISO, and International Electrotechnical Commission, IEC 2702. So that's ISO IEC 27002. So these are three separate frameworks that we will go through one by one. So the first framework is ITIL or ITIL, formerly known by its longer unabbreviated term, Information Technology Infrastructure Library. So this is developed by the UK Cabinet Office of Governance Commerce or OGC as a library of best practice processes for IT service management. So ideally, ITIL focuses on the IT infrastructure and service management. So this has a set of detailed practice for IT activities such as IT service management, ITSM, and IT asset management, ITAM, that focus on aligning IT services with the needs of the business. So IT service management environment effectively and efficiently deliver business services to end users and customers. So ITIL is comprised of five core guidelines, namely strategy, which are guidelines or best practice process to map the IT strategy with overall business goals and objectives. Design, best practice processes or requirements implemented to guide toward a solution designed to meet business needs. Transition aims at managing change, risk, and quality assurance during the deployment of an IT service. Operation guidelines are best practice processes put into place to maintain adequate and effective IT services once implemented in the production environment. And lastly, continuous improvement. This is constantly looking for ways to improve the overall process and service provision. So the ITL framework should be chosen when the goal of the organization is to improve the quality of IT management services. So this is especially applicable if the organization is heavily reliant on IT processes so that the company would have good or high quality IT management services. The ITIL framework assists organization in creating IT services that can effectively help manage the daily tasks, particularly when the focus is on either the customer or the end user. So this can also be applied by what we call mga shared service centers or BPO provisioning IT services. Since they focus on improving the IT services to manage the daily tasks. Okay, so we have the next framework, control objectives for business and IT. So this is an IT governance framework that helps organizations meet today's business challenges in the areas of regulatory compliance, risk management, and alignment of IT strategy with organizational goals. So this is an authoritative international set of generally accepted IT practices or control objectives designed to help employees, managers, executives, and auditors in deciding in understanding IT systems, discharging fiduciary responsibilities, and deciding adequate levels of security and roles. So COVID is more focused on regulatory compliance. So meaning compliance with laws and regulations. So this is the difference between all the other frameworks. That is, COVID is more reliant or has more focus in complying with the rules, the laws, and regulation. That's why it has been uh, adopted better by auditors and the government. Okay, so there are five principles in COVID 5. So we are using COVID 5 because it's the one in our materials, but the most recent version of COVID is COVID 2019. But there's not much difference. There's just some new word on the principles and the terms. But overall, it is still the same standard or framework. So meeting stakeholder needs is the first principle, covering the enterprise end to end, applying a single integrated framework, enabling a holistic approach, and separating governance from management. So this framework, although it's a little bit complicated, well, it's really complicated because it has been designed to cover everything. So it's bigger, although it can be tailor fit or be adjusted for use by all types or all size types of organizations, including commercial, non-for-profit, or the public sector. So this provides a set of control objectives that not only helps IT management and governance professionals manage their IT operations, but also IT auditors in their quest for examining those objectives. And when should you use COVID? So the selection of COVID may be appropriate when the goal of the organization is not only to understand and align IT business objectives, so they should be aligned, IT business objectives, but also to address the areas of regulatory compliance and risk management. Okay, the next standard is ISO IEC 2702. So this is a global standard used together with ISO IEC 27001 framework that provides best practice recommendations related to the management of information security. So as we have discussed earlier, ITIL sa IT Service Management, ITSM and ITAM, COVID is regulatory compliance and risk management. So ISO 2700 is regarding information security. So this applies to those in charge of initiating, implementing, and or maintaining information security management systems. So this assists in implementing commonly accepted information security controls and procedures. So there are two parts. This includes techniques that help organizations secure their information assets and actual security techniques related to requirements for establishing, implementing, maintaining, assessing, and continually improving an information security management system within the context of the organization. So these requirements are generic and are intended to be applicable to all organizations, regardless of type, size, or nature. ISO IEC 27001 2013. So guidelines for information security communication, which is ISO IEC TIS 27003, guidelines for implementing security management, that is initiating, implementing, maintaining, and improving information security for intersector, interorganizational communication. That is ISO IEC 270102015. And then ISO IEC 270132015, guidance on the integrated implementation of an information security management system as specified in 27001, and a service management system as specified in ISO IEC 20000-1. Okay. So ISO usually have what we call checklists, and they have their own auditors who check for compliance. That's why some company you will see that they have an ISO certification. But don't be confused because there are a lot of classes of certification. So the particular ISO standard for information security management systems is 27002. Okay. So ISO IEC 27002 assists organization to manage the security of assets, including but not limited to financial information, intellectual property, employee details of information entrusted by third parties. So its purpose is to help organizations to select a proper security measure by utilizing available domains of security controls. Each domain specifies control objectives that provides further guidance on how organizations may attempt to implement the framework. And now, when should you choose to implement the ISO IEC 2702 framework? So this framework should be chosen when IT senior management, such as the CIO, targets an information security architecture that provides general security measures to comply with federal laws and regulations. So while ITIL, COBIT, and ISO IEC 27002 are best practice IT-related frameworks to regulatory and corporate governance compliances, challenge is to implement an integrated framework that draws from these three standards. Okay, so it's gonna be difficult to apply everything because you'll have also to have persons who are adept or skilled in ITIL, COBIT, and the ISO 27002 standard. So the challenge is to implement in an integrated framework that draws on these three standards. So that's why the joint framework is put together by the ITGI, or the IT Governance Institute, and the OGC is a significant step learning or leading to such a- direction. So the joint framework is composed of three interrelated items. That is to implement a single integrated compliance method that delivers corporate governance general control objectives, meet the regulatory requirements of data and privacy related regulation, and with the joint framework, you can get ready for external certification for the ISO standards, such as ISO 27001 and ISO 20000, both of which demonstrate compliance. So implementing a joint framework leads organization toward effective regulatory compliance and improves their competitiveness. So when you comply, you have better regulatory compliance and you can improve your competitiveness. And the implementations of the framework is just discussed is paramount to addressing relevant areas within the IT field. So of equal importance is the establishment of metrics to measure IT performance. These metrics should not only be in place, but also regularly assessed for consistency with the goals and objectives of the organization. Any questions so far? If there is none, let's just have a 10-minute break before we proceed to the next topic. So now we're back with IT performance metrics. So for IT performance metrics, so both organizations, so the organizational level metrics and IT management must be in full support of IT performance metrics. So they are used to be measured, should be closely aligned to the objectives of the organization. So initially, we create what we call a critical metric set. This is the set are a few key metrics that are critical to the successful management of the function and should be identified and applied to the environment. So here are the following steps in setting up IT performance matrix. So first, so identify the critical set. Number two, develop and implement the initial measurements from the critical set mets. Three, show the result to the management and the governance board. 4. Identify other areas that can be measured and provide report for those areas. And then finally, present results in a way or in a format that is easy to understand. Additionally, there are two guidelines. Area must be measured. Area to be measured must help in the development of the matrix. So for example, within the IT department, let's say change management. So in setting metrics for the change department or the change management office, you should seek output from the change management office. So this is so they have or they seek more active change or they seek more active participation in the development and improvement of the metrics. Number two, measures are applied to events and process not to individuals. So what you are measuring is the department, the process, and events, never the person. Okay? So this should yield effective measures that are reliable and valid. Just like information and data, for a measure to be effective, should be able to rely on that measure, and that measure should be valid. Questions so far? So one of the biggest metrics or use of metrics is what we call the IT balance scorecard. So we have different questions whenever we have IT governance or IT investment. So is our current IT investment plan consistent with the organization's strategic goals and objectives? So for example, the strategy of the company is a cloud first strategy. So ibig sabihin, the business will invest more in cloud related technologies. So dapat ang IT strategy is towards improvement in the cloud skills. Okay? So baka mamaya ang IT strategy cloud first pero ang main purchases nila ay mainframe computers and servers. So it doesn't match. The investment plan doesn't match the cloud first strategy versus buying their own hardware. So was the IT application just developed a success? Was it implemented effectively and efficiently? So is our IT department adding value to the organization as a whole? And should our current IT services be outsourced to third parties? So, depending on the goals and the strategy of the business, there might be changes that can be developed or plans that can be obtained through the use of the IT balance scorecard. So, the ITBS provides an overall picture of IT performance aligned to the objectives of the organization. It specifically measures and evaluates IT related activities. For example, IT application projects, functions performed by the IT department from various perspectives. So the perspectives are then translated into corresponding metrics that reconcile with the organization's mission and strategic objectives. And results from the metrics are assessed for adequacy against target values and or organization initiatives. And so ITPS is actually what we call a or should be a living document and should be periodically revised for adequacy by company personnel. Okay. So there are four perspectives in an ITPS. So we have ID generated business value, future orientation, operation efficiency and effectiveness, and end user service satisfaction. So first perspective is the IT generated business value. For the balance scorecard, we should be able to determine that IT provides value through delivering successful projects and keeping operations running. IT projects deliver business value by automating business process or by automating business process. IT services also deliver value by being available for the organization as needed. So here are sample metrics under the perspective IT generated business value. So sometimes there may be a perception that IT is a or is just a cost center. Since costs might be growing without the recognition that business costs should be dropping or revenue growing by a greater margin. So metrics to measure business value may address the function of the IT department, value generated by IT projects, management of IT investments, sales made to outsiders or third parties. The actual metrics may involve the following. Okay, percentage of resources devoted to strategic projects, perceived relationship between IT management and senior level management, computation of traditional financial evaluation methods, for example, return on investment or ROI in payback period, actual versus budgeted expenses, percentages over and under overall IT budget, and revenues from IT-related services and/or products. So the next perspective in the IT balance scorecard is the future orientation. So future orientation is concerned with positioning IT for the future by focusing on the following objectives. So future orientation is the company having a look or a focus into future or into the future. So for example, we have Kodak, which is a camera company, a photography and imaging company. But they usually they started with a large share of the market, or they have the largest share of the market. However, after a while, or due to the proliferation of mobile phones and digital camera, they went out of business. So they weren't able to future-proof their business. So the following objectives is related to future orientation, training and educating IT personnel for future IT challenges, improving service capabilities, staffing management effectiveness, enhancing enterprise architecture, and researching for emerging technologies and their potential value to the organization. Sample metrics in future orientation are the following: continuously improving ID skills through education, training, and development, delivering internal projects consistent to plan, staffing metrics by function using utilization and billable ratios, voluntary turnover by performance level, etc. Developing and approving an enterprise architecture plan in adherence to the standards. And lastly, conducting relevant research on newly emerging technologies and their suitability for organization. Moving on, the third perspective is operation efficiency and effectiveness. So this focuses on the internal processes in place to deliver IT products and services in an efficient and effective manner. So internal operations may be assessed by measuring and evaluating IT processes in areas such as quality, responsiveness, security, and safety, among others. So other processes to be considered may include hardware and software supply and support, problem management, management of IT personnel, and the effectiveness and efficiency of current communication channels. Metrics here can yield productivity information about the performance of technologies and of specific personnel. Okay, last but not the least is end user service satisfaction. Okay, the end user. The end user for IT purposes may be internal personnel or external. For example, users accessing interorganizational IT systems or services. And from an end user's perspective, the value of IT will be based on whether their jobs are completed timely and accurately. A mission for this perspective would be to deliver value adding products and services to end users. Related objectives would include maintaining acceptable levels of customer satisfaction, partnerships between IT and business, application development performance, and service level performance. Metrics used to measure the objectives should focus on three areas. One, being the preferred supplier for applications and operations, establishing and maintaining relationships with the user community, and satisfying the end user needs. It would be necessary for IT personnel to establish and maintain positive relationships with the user community in order to understand and anticipate their needs. So those are the perspective or the four perspectives of the IT balance scorecards. Now that you understand the perspective, here we have the steps within how to make an IT balance scorecard. You can refer to the LMS modules and under IT performance metrics, you will see there that's 3.3. By the end, you will see an example of the IT balance scorecard or IBS. So first step, have both senior management and IT management on board from the start. Make them aware with the concept of the IBS. So you should be having what we call the tone at the top. There should be a mandate from the management to do this. You cannot do the IT balance scorecard on your own. Should be done with the mandate from the management. Next, now we have collection of data. So coordinate the collection and analysis of data related to corporate strategy and objectives, business strategy, IT strategy, company mission, and company specific goals. Traditional business evaluation metrics and methods, including ROI, payback period, etc., currently implemented for IT performance measurement. Next, potential metrics applicable to the four IBS perspective. Okay, next, define the company's specific objectives and goals of the IT department or functional area from each of the four perspectives. Next, develop a preliminary IBS based on the defined objectives and goals of the organization and the data outlined in the previous steps. Next, request revisions, comments, and feedback from management after revising the IBS and have the IBS formally approved and ready for use or ready to be used by the organization. And lastly, communicate the IBS development process and its underlying rationale to all stakeholders. So let's see. Okay, so here under modules, under performance metrics, you see here an example, IBS. So here we have the IV generated business values and the metrics. Future orientation, all the metrics, operational efficiency and effectiveness, and end user service satisfaction. Okay, next is about regulatory compliance and internal controls. So one of the key processes that the organizations need to manage would be, of course, compliance with regulations and controls. So this might need a dedicated team to sift through all financial, security, privacy, and industry-specific regulatory requirements to determine the impact on processes and information systems. This can be satisfied with the implementation of controls outlined in COVID. And also, SOX or Sarbanes-Oxley of 2002 and other tools can help organizations identify laws and regulations and track the processes implemented to address them. Next, IT strategy. So we have talked about IT governance. Now we move on to the IT strategy part. So IT has become the critical ingredient in business strategies as both enabler and enhancer of organizations' goals and objectives. So the strategy is an important first step toward meeting the challenging and changing business environment. A formal vision strategy is also a formal vision to guide in the acquisition, allocation, and management of resources to fulfill the organization's objectives. IT strategy, therefore, or IT strategic plan, formally guides the acquisition, allocation, and management of IT resources consistent with the goals and objectives of the organization. So, one of the promulgators of the IT strategy would be the IT steering committee. So this is composed of decision makers from various constituencies in the organization to resolve conflicting priorities. So the members should be senior management and the CIO. This is responsible for determining the overall IT investment strategy, ensuring that IT investments are aligned with business priorities and that IT and business resources are available to help IT or help enable IT to deliver upon its expectations. The IT steering committee also helps ensure integration of the business and the IT strategic plan. So this facilitates the integration of business and technology strategies, plans, and operations by employing the principles of joint ownership, teamwork, accountability, and understanding of major projects. So the IT steering committee has several tasks and thus includes the following. So reviewing business and technology strategies and plan, prioritizing major development projects, developing communication strategies, reviewing development and implementation plans for all major projects, providing business decisions on major design issues for all projects, monitoring status, schedule, and milestones for all major projects, reviewing and approving major change requests for all major projects, reviewing project budgets and ROIs, resolving conflicts between business and technology groups, and monitoring business benefits during and after implementation of major projects. So, with IT strategy, an important part of that is communication. You have to make your strategy known. Effective communication is critical to coordinate the efforts of internal and external resources to accomplish the organization's goals. Communication should occur at multiple levels, starting by having internal weekly staff meetings. This should cover the employees within the department. Communication should also take place via town hall meetings, which are typically attended to and addressed to by all employees in the organization. So, communication between IT and the organization, particularly of matters such as IT strategy, goals, etc., should be timely and consistent. Also, very important then that communication should also include all external business partners and customers related to the organization. So now we have the plan. We also know how to communicate. We also need to have operational planning. Once there is an understanding of the organization's objectives and IT strategy, that strategy needs to be translated into operating plans, also called operationalization. The annual operating plan process includes setting top priorities for the overall IT function as well as for individual IT departments, including developing their annual budget, creating resource and capacity plans, and preparing individual performance plans for all IT staff. So, operating plans will also identify and schedule the IT projects that will be initiated and the IT service levels expected. Delivery of these plans should be controlled by a series of governance process. So here we have the operational planning governance process. First, we have demand management, project initiation, technical review, procurement and vendor management, and financial management. So first, let's go through demand management. So a demand management process can help ensure that resources are devoted to projects that have a strong business case and are also approved by the senior management. So the demand management process helps ensure that senior management is on board and has provided conceptual approval to the project to proceed through the internal or initial requirements definition and conceptual design phases of the development life cycle. A demand management process ensures that a project has different as a business justification, a business and IT sponsor, and a consistent approach for approving projects. A demand management process also ensures alignment of application and infrastructure groups, that all project costs are identified to improve decision making, that there are means to weed out non-essential projects, and that the means are identified to control IT capacity, and spending. Next, we have project initiation. So once a project with a strong business case has been approved through demand management, it should undergo an initiation process that determines its total cost and benefit. So this is usually done by defining high-level business requirements and a conceptual solution. Building a project estimate takes time and resources, and it also takes time from business users to develop requirements and a business case. It also takes time from software developers to develop a solution and cost estimate. So after a project has conceptual approval, business users and software programmers can work together to develop detailed requirements and project estimates that will be used in the final business case and form the basis for the project budget. Next, we do technical review. So the technical solution needs to be also evaluated before moving forward to ensure compliance with technology standards. So a technical review process helps ensure that the right solution is selected, that it integrates effectively with other components of technology, for example, network and other existing software, and that it can be supported with minimal investments in infrastructure. One way to control technology solutions is to implement a technical steering committee, which is separate and not to be confused with the IT steering committee, but representatives from the various technical disciplines and enterprise architects. A technical steering committee would provide a control mechanism for evaluating and approving technology solutions. So, in a technical review assessment, the following are checked or assessed: technical feasibility, if there are alternative technologies available, architecture, in-house skill compatibility, existing environments and replacement, implementation, licensing and cost consideration, research and analysis views, and vendor company profile and financial viability. So after the technical review, there would be procurement and vendor management. So depending on the plan or the project, there would be some procurement and vendor management involved. So processes and procedures should be in place to define how the procurement of IT resources, including people, hardware, software, and other services, will be performed. So IT procurement involves strategic and administrative tasks such as defining requirements and specifications. So performing the actual IT service or resource acquisition only after assessing and selecting the appropriate vendor and fulfilling contract requirements. So vendor selection usually involves the evaluation of 3 to 5 vendors, and the IT steering committee regularly evaluates IT vendors and suppliers and make the ultimate decision of which vendors or suppliers to bring on board. And lastly, financial management. So in the financial management governance process, Potential investment services and asset portfolios are evaluated so that they can get incorporated in cost benefit analysis and ultimately within the budget. IT budgeting, for instance, considers IT products, resources, and services in order to assist the planning of IT operations. So, budgeting is a strategic planning tool, typically expressed in quantitative terms, which aids the monitoring of specific activities and events. This will also provide forecasts and projections of income and expenses, which are used strategically for measuring financial activities and events. So budgets are useful to management when determining whether specific revenues or cost activities are being controlled. Revenues being higher than budget estimates or costs being lower than estimated budget amounts. Budgets lead how organizations might perform financially, operationally, etc. should certain strategies or events take place. So that completes the operational planning governance process. And also wrapping up the IT governance and strategy module. So just to conclude, IT governance establishes a fundamental basis for managing IT to deliver value to the organization. Effective governance aligns IT to the organization and establishes controls to measure meeting this objective. So three effective and best practice IT-related frameworks commonly used by organizations are ITIL, COVID, and ISO IEC 27002. These three frameworks provide organizations with value and the means to address different angles within the IT arena. Realizing the value of IT requires a partnership between management and IT, and this partnership should include managing enterprise risk as well as measuring performance assessments consistent with existing strategies and goals. These performance measures should be aligned to the objectives of the organization. Establishing an example of a common tool to measure IT performance is the IT Balance Scorecard or IBS, which provides an overall picture of IT performance aligned to the objectives of the organization. It specifically measures and evaluates IT-related activities, such as IT projects and functions, performed by the IT department from the perspectives like IT-generated business value, future orientation, operational efficiency and effectiveness, and end user satisfaction. Establishing effective controls in IT and ensuring regulatory compliance is also a joint effort. Well, control technology is a result of an organization that considers controls a priority. Organizations need to include controls in system requirements to make this happen. Also discuss a strategy as an important first step in toward meeting the challenging and changing business environment. An IT strategic plan is a formal vision to guide in the acquisition, allocation, and management of IT resources to fulfill the organization's objective. And one way to achieve alignment is to involve business leaders in the development of the IT strategic plan via establishing an IT steering committee. The committee helps ensure integration of the business and IT strategic plan. And lastly, to ensure the effective use of resources and delivery of IT projects, as well as proper alignment with business objectives, organizations employ governance processes within their annual operating plan. This process addresses how to manage project demands, initiate projects, perform technical reviews, procure products and manage vendors, and control financial investments. So we are now open for any questions regarding what we have discussed. You can raise your hand or put the question in the chat box. Okay, if you have no more questions, then that's the end of this module. Thank you for attending this lesson. You